Just to sort of set the context of this, Mike started off this morning talking about people, and particularly senior people, and we're going to talk a lot about that in a minute. Kevlin then talked about people and scaling down, and we're going to be talking about people, but actually the opposite, scaling up, very, very large scale agility. And I use the term agility deliberately. I'm not from an agile background, and we're going to talk about organization agility and potentially cross-organizational agility. And then Kylie, I attended a session with Kylie, which was about leadership and scrum masters and product owners. I was a bit upset. I was in a team that was, the scrum master was Hitler, and the product owner was Margaret Thatcher, which would be quite an interesting team. Kelly then talked about OKRs, and we're going to talk a bit about outcomes, and particularly large-scale strategic outcomes. And the session we've just attended in here earlier with Jill and Linda talked about strategic change. And that's the level we're going to be talking about here. And we've sort of, because we're on the beach, I'm a keen surfer, Craig's a keen mountaineer, we've sort of linked this to outdoor pursuits. You can link it to any other activity, but just to give it a bit of a beachy feel. So we are going to talk about the active and successful involvement of executives in organizational agility, but we're going to link it to surfing. So that's sort of the analogy we're going to use, the metaphor we're going to use. So just to introduce ourselves and what we're about, as I said, I'm Graham Floyd, there's my LinkedIn profile. I'm a keen surfer, I live down here in the West Country, I moved down here about 10 years ago. And I've been working mainly with public sector organisations, and particularly of recent and particularly relevant to where we are today, I've worked with the Vaccines Task Force and the government, particularly around large-scale, what I'd call black swan event type agility. And I've previously come from a military background, and a lot of the people I'm working with are from military. So Craig, do you just want to introduce yourself?
Just click it.
Click it for you.
So, as Graham said, we sort of linked it into outdoor pursuits. I particularly enjoyed going to the Himalayas. That's Kanchenjunga, second highest mountain in the world, which I decided to do from 3 of the 4 compass points. And we decided to take a slightly twee picture, but it worked well to get my picture up there as well as the mountains. So we wanted to introduce ourselves, but we also wanted to get to know you a little bit as well. So just, you know, where did you come from? What did you do? So just sort of we also decided we were not going to do anything technological. We're fed up of Teams, we're fed up of Zoom, and we assume you are as well. And so it's all manual, physical, and as low tech as possible. But just sort of hands up in terms of in Agile teams.
Wow.
We can be proud of it, it's okay. From the business, or customer, or user, or more technical, less technical, any other roles anybody wants to shout out, or?
Less technical.
Less technical.
I'm a senior writer and editor. I write content for the websites.
Now, so it's just useful for us to understand where you're coming from. We're using a metaphor, and we'll probably run out of it at times. But we thought it was quite useful with sort of waves and not being able to control them and being able to do it in slightly different ways.
Cheers. Thanks, Craig. So a rather red slide here. It's a question, really, and people shout out, who do you think in your organisation or beyond your organisation has made the biggest ever change? Straight to it. So you've seen my slides. Okay, COVID is the biggest change maker. When Craig and I first moved to this presentation 2 years ago, COVID wasn't even around. We were working with executives at lots of different organisations, from retail, banking, government, and we were struggling to get the executive teams to engage with us. They'd say, yeah, we want to go Agile, we want to do Agile, we want to be Agile, blah, 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 blah. You'd get in and you'd say, this is what it's about. Oh, I'm not so sure about that. Not so sure about that. And this presentation 2 years ago could have been very, very different. It would have been, we're really struggling to do this. This is what we found is successful. I'm pleased to say that what we can do today is we can talk about the great stuff that's been done over the last 2 years, mainly because of COVID, but mainly, if I click onto the next slide, and one of my favourite quotes from a very, very famous surfer, Laird Hamilton, is, we're all equal before a wave. And that's what happened due to COVID. Lots and lots of senior leaders realised, and we heard in the presentation just before, whereby they had 90% of their people who couldn't access their systems, and the leadership had to immediately say, we've got to do something about that. Not a case of we'd like to, or we'll think about it, or we'll get some consultants in to advise us. It's here and now today. So that's just to position this that, you know, we were going to talk about the negativity 2 years ago. We now want to talk about the positivity. If I move on just to the agenda, we're going to talk about 5 key things. We're going to talk about agility, the basics. That's organizational agility, not scrum teams, not Kanban and that type of stuff, but some of the organizational agility basics. Getting started, an analogy of surfing, going out into the surf, learning how to surf, getting down to the beach and understanding the conditions. We'll then talk about wave mastery. How do you become a bit of an expert? How do you scale it up? How do you go surfing with other people? We'll then talk about avoiding the wipeouts, and we've all seen those in our own organizations. And then we'll talk about successful big wave riding and some of the success we've had with some of the organizations we've been working with. Before we get into that agenda, though, I'd just like to talk about 2 key people, coming back to Mike and Kevlin's comments about people, that I've been working with over the last 2 years. So most of you will know this person, John Van Tam, JVT. If you're looking for a program, I wanted to show some of this, I wasn't allowed to because it's on Channel 4, and so I wasn't licensed to. But there's a program called JABBED inside Britain's Vaccine Task Triumph. And it is absolutely legendary in an organisation that is set up overnight due to a black swan event, and it has to react to it, and it pulls together people from all different organisations. JVT was legendary in how he led that, and there was many other leaders in it. You'll see them in the programme. And I mean, he became an absolute cult. You'll see there some of the headlines. People creating Christmas cards with him and all the rest of it. These are the type of people that I'm talking about, and it's how you engage with these people with an organisational agility agenda. Similarly, on the same task force, Dame Kate Bingham. There she is. She received damehood because of her work on the task force. Legendary, formidable person. This is her doing her favourite pastime sport, taking it back to sports. Snorkel, bog, swimming. So all of these people have got a bit of a mad side to them, and a lot of what we'll present to you today is how do you get under the skin of some of these people, how do you take them on the agenda, and how do you not turn them off. So that's just 2 people that we've been working with. I'm going to hand you over to Craig, and he's going to talk about some of the basics.
So just 3 or 4 things to talk about. Part of it is just thinking back about those COVID events. And I'm sure when COVID hit, nobody talked about doing agile transformation. We've got to do shit. We've got to do it quick. We've got to change the way we work. Whether Agile was involved, and that's the Agile we're talking about. So not naming it, it's what people do that we could then say, oh, in hindsight, yeah, that's sort of Agile, but not doing it because of Agile. Typically doing it because they have to. And I think COVID is just a really good example of that. There was no choice. Doesn't mean things went right, or necessarily they went correctly, but things had to change. And the only overriding sort of direction that had to get to was time. Everything was about time. And so understand sort of what is the extent. So although we're talking about agility and agile and business agility and stuff, what we're actually saying is just how are people able to change the way they're working, how, if you want to call that modern management techniques, or any other sort of formal words, but what is there? And what's the driver to change? The sort of black swan event of COVID has changed perceptions. And the idea that we'd all work from home 2 years ago was, you know, it can't be done. Technically, it can't be done. And then all of a sudden, everybody can do it. So that reason has gone away. So what are the underlying aspects around the organisation? What can change? What can't change? And it's more about making them the way that they're thinking about the problems, and not just, okay, we can't do that. So the reason that we didn't all work remote is because technically it wouldn't work, because we can't do it. And then we had to. And so it wasn't a real problem, and it wasn't a real block, it was an excuse. And so understanding what the extent of the challenge is, what those underlying aspects are, is key around that, and the sort of iceberg metaphor is quite good about that, as useful, keeps the water theory in there as well, metaphor in there as well. And then just, it's going to be disruptive. It's going to be extremely disruptive. Largely because of the way, so Graham and I tend to work with bigger, larger, older organizations. They've got traditional ways of working, and Agile is disruptive to them because it's changing those previous ways of working. But if you're, and in the previous talk, Linda sort of said it was the pace of change that had to be different. Traditional organizations are there for slow pace of change, months or years. COVID, but also just the digital disruptors are moving so much faster than that. The mechanics of the firm have to move faster as well, and that is disruptive. You're going to change power bases within organizations. You're going to change line management. An organization we worked with, power was the number of people you managed. We wanted to change the number of people being managed and dissolve it and get rid of layers. And it was just hugely disruptive, but not because of what we changed, because of the power base changing. And people. It's all about the people and how they react to that. So how do we do this? How do we explain it? How do we accept that it's going to be quite emotional or very emotional? And how do we deal with that? But deal with the execs as people. They're people. How do we support the people? It's not just, oh, they're over there, they're doing it all wrong. So how do we actually get them involved as well? And part of that is what words can we use? So can we use the word experiment? I've worked in lots of organizations. What I mean is experiment, but you can't use the word experiment because experiments fail. And we don't fail. So you know, what can we do that says actually change the risk profile, change the appetite for risk, and yes, you've got to fail some of the time, otherwise you can't learn. We want to do things we've never done before. How do we do that? How do we not do something that we can guarantee will succeed? What words can we use around that? How do we do that? How can we get the execs to say about doing something and it didn't go so well? And what did we learn from it? Let's talk about what we learned from that rather than, oh, they failed. Are the execs allowed to say that amongst themselves? Or will the others all instantly bring the knives out and they're out of here? So how do we actually allow that to happen and change that dynamic within the organization as well? And how do we empower the people? So empowerment is one of the buzzwords around Agile and self-organizing. Well, what does that mean? How do you actually allow that to happen? And I've had managers go, oh, you know, I've empowered all the people and they flipping don't do anything. You know, because you've got decades of telling them exactly what to do, and if they didn't do it, getting hit over the head with a big stick. So how do you change that dynamic? How do you actually allow the people to make decisions, and if they're wrong, it's okay? So you hear about stories about, you know, the technician that made a mistake at 2 o'clock in the morning because there was a serious incident and they were fixing it and it went really wrong. Next day in the sort of war room doing the review, and everybody's expecting this person, you know, they're all setting big gap around them because, oh dear, they're not going to be here much longer. The exec comes in and apologizes because you should never have been in that situation. We shouldn't have put you in that situation where you would have made that decision and it could have gone wrong. That's the right way that you want to do it, and that's leadership, and that's showing how that works. And it then, you know, next time, well, hopefully we're not going to be in that situation, but if it does happen, it's not, you know, the person who actually has the problem. It's the leadership and the management taking the responsibility for that. And it's then, you know, how do we feed that? How do we help with that? How do we do retrospectives on what went wrong and learn from it and actually talk about it? So, you know, Spotify and other organizations, they regularly have reviews, but they have them instantly. And it's not about pointing fingers, it's about learning.
Cheers, thanks Craig. So Craig's covered the basics there. So how do you get out there? How do you take the execs out surfing? When I landed in the vaccines task force, how do you get things started? We had 1,000 potential vaccines. Does anybody actually know how long it normally takes to get a vaccine from concept through to on the shelves? Any guesses?
10 years.
10 years. Bingo. 10 years. We did it in 6 months. We had 1,000 potential vaccines when we started, And within 2 to 3 weeks, we'd narrowed it down to less than 400. And then over a period of a month or so more, down to 14. And then beyond that, we investigated those 14. So picking up on some of Craig's points about options, keep your options open. But you've got to get started. Start, narrow it down, narrow it down, narrow it down. So I think there's 5 key points. The first one is this, and I've learnt this a very hard way, is as a coach, as an Agile coach, coaching teams, that when you get amongst the executives, you are not in control at all. There's a whole load of sharks out there, and it's a totally different ballgame, and you are not in control as a coach at all. And you have to accept that. That these execs will go wherever they want to. What is going to happen will happen. That there's mutations, there's various other things. In Brexit, they weren't expecting that. So, you know, accept you're not in control at all as an Agile coach or as an Agile team member. The right time, the right place, and the right approach to engagement. Execs are very, very busy people. They don't always want to engage with you. And if you try to engage them at the wrong time, the results will not be good. The right approach. Find out what these people are about. Find out what's keeping them awake. Find out what's on their agenda for today. And try and solve that for them immediately. Sensing what's going on around you, and particularly in Brexit, in COVID, Afghanistan more recently, is constantly being aware of what's going on around you. It's not a set agenda. There's not a backlog. There's not a standard cadence quite often. You have to create a lot of that stuff. But sense what's going on around you, keep sensing it, and keep constantly adapting and pivoting to whatever is going on around you. New outbreaks. I had a very senior member of staff who got caught out in India and couldn't get back, things like that. So constantly keep your senses and know what's going on. And practice, practice, and practice, and use best practices. You can apply a lot of the Agile techniques. You can apply a lot of the lean portfolio management techniques, but practice them, and see how they go, and learn from how they go. Quite often execs won't be comfortable with a lot of those things. They won't want to attend a daily stand-up. They won't want to attend a sprint demo at the end of 2 weeks. But try and adapt those things so that they work for those very, very busy people. And if they're not working, try other best techniques. From Lean, from Six Sigma, from Agile, the whole caboose is there. And then finally, act on advice and pivot if needed. There's coaches out there, there's leaders out there. Ask for advice, ask for feedback, constantly be seeking advice, and then take all that advice, decide what you're going to do with it, and then move on from there. So that's a bit about how you first engage with the execs. I'm going to hand over to Craig, who's going to talk a bit about how you might master some of the wave riding techniques.
First sort of question about this. Any sort of observations about the picture? Are these participants or observers?
It's not enough surfboards.
In the picture, maybe. So do we think they're observing, or are they just watching?
It looks like analysis.
Yeah. So they need to be involved. They need to, so Linda mentioned earlier on, and sort of people talk about Gemba, and Gemba walk is sort of the buzzword, but getting involved. Actually being part of whatever it is, and learning from that. They're not going to learn how to surf by sitting on a beach and watching other people do it. They could criticize them, and they might have some quite intelligent criticisms of them, but they're not going to learn how to surf. They actually need to get in there and do it. Maybe they would learn something from doing both, but these are participants, and it's participating in. So we'll talk a little bit later, but often it's execs are accused of not participating. Them over there are going to be agile. I don't need to be, I'm not involved with this, I don't need to change. We need people to be involved with. They are going to change. We're talking about mindset change, and that comes from within the whole organisation. It's not just them over there that need to change. It's not a point fix. It's much wider than that. And how they are able to do that, and how we can bring it in. The agile words are often just not helpful. It alienates people, it makes you sound really clever when you're not, and you have to throw in some Japanese words as well to sound even more clever, and it's just not helpful. How do we get some of the ideas, so empowerment and self-organizing, and what does that actually mean, and how do we actually get them to embody that? What are they going to do differently? All too often they'll talk about, yes, of course, this is really good, usually because the whole corporate culture is we're going agile. And so any of these words we have to do, but they haven't got a clue what that means or how to do it. So we need them inclusive. We need to, as Graham was just saying, practice. And how do we actually get them to practice doing this as well?
Cool. Thanks, Craig. So the pitfalls, avoiding the big wipeouts. You've engaged with the exec. You've helped them learn to write waves. You're helping them master those waves. Have people got any ideas what the big pitfalls are within your organisations about engaging execs? Have people got experience of trying to engage with execs, trying to get the whole enterprise organisational agility and not succeeding? Sorry? Into detail, great, brilliant, thank you.
It's to the point earlier, it's words they need to understand. It's taking time to help them understand what that actually means. They need to see themselves as stakeholders, serious stakeholders in this transition, because otherwise it's just lip service.
Yep, cool, thank you. So that's time, terminology, vocabulary, and spending the time to explain some of that stuff. Brilliant, thank you very much.
Setting no clear agenda.
Sorry?
Setting no clear agenda when you engage in detail.
Yep, super, thank you. Here.
For us, it was perceived loss of control. They like a lot of the comfort that, frozen boards and...
They want to remain in control, and that's part of accepting as a coach that you're not in control, and I'll talk a bit in a minute about leaders accepting that they're not in control as well, and how you might overcome that. Great, any others?
Our biggest one is the time. I mean, the COVID provided it, variety of boards, local government, so you like a board or two.
Yep.
There was lots of reactionary and workforces and task force to get us through COVID, but now we're coming on the other side of it, they're slipping back. So actually, we might have been agile once, not that they'd call it agile, but we might have been agile once, but actually we're going to put all the boards back in.
Yep.
We want to have our control back. We're not we might say we want to empower, but practically we don't.
Boards, steering groups, task forces, management reviews.
Yep.
Yeah, and people talk about going back to normal, and it's like, why?
Exactly.
Why would you go back to normal? Yeah, it's been crap, but actually there's a lot of good coming out of this. Thank you for that. Any others? There was one over here.
Yeah, our biggest one is just distractions in general and shiny new projects and other opportunities that they want to jump to.
Yep.
So we can get them aboard, get them excited, so they'll agree to something, and then next week, month, they'll find something else that they want to.
Definitely, the latest toys, the latest fad, the latest, I can get some smarty points for this. And that's why I think the OKR stuff that Alan talked about this morning is really, really important. Get that set, big strategic outcomes, and keep everything focused to that. If I put up here, you might not be able to read this, but I will read some of it out if I just so. So this is from the 15th State of Agile report. Interestingly, I don't think the first one is very much a leadership agenda. It's about processes and practices. But the next five, I think are about the leadership agenda. These are well documented. There's other slides further on which I won't go through as an appendix, but it actually shows how they've changed over time, in that the leadership agenda has moved up and has improved, and other things have moved down this. But the organisational culture at odds with Agile values, that's, let's get back to normal. We moved away from all our boards and steering groups and all the rest of it, but let's get back to our normal now. General organisation resistance to change, lack of skills experience with Agile methods, training, development, learning, so on forth, that a lot of people have talked about. Not enough leadership participation. Brilliant, it's right up there. That is a barrier to going Agile across the whole organisation. What are we going to do about it?
You can tell who wrote this, though. You can see who the villain is in this. And to some extent, demonising people and doing it wrong. The previous one about how do we avoid. Why are you avoiding pitfalls? When are you going to learn? When are you going to have those wipeouts? If you don't have the wipeouts, yes, don't do the wipeout that kills you. It's not a good idea. But falling off a board, I water ski as well, and I never had fun unless I fell off. And so you know, you've got to learn, so you've got to do that. How do we change the language? How do we actually even, you know, that's natural language. How do we avoid the pitfalls? That's exactly what execs talk about. We don't want to fail, but how do we get it right? Because that's what the shareholders want, and that's how we work. So how do we change the language where we're allowed to talk about we're going to learn? What are we allowed to do to say that? How are we able to change that sort of agenda?
Thanks. And then the final one, inadequate management support and sponsorship, again, a leadership agenda. Moving on then to changing the mindsets and practices, which Craig's alluding to there. How do you go successful big wave riding? And there's 5 here, I think, if I can remember correctly. This one here is now, not only as an Agile coach, but also now as a leader, getting them to accept that they're not in control. Saying to them, it's okay not to be in control. It's okay to fall off your board. It's okay to learn, get back on your board. I'll help you get back on your board. So getting them to accept, this is a huge one, I think, that I've particularly in some of the government initiatives I've been involved with, leaders having to accept a greater level of risk. Amongst all of these, what I call black swan events, these large changes, these forced transformations, leaders have no other option. They are empowered to accept a greater level of risk. They're empowered to say, okay, we're going to develop some vaccines. They might not work. We'll put them through regulation, we'll get them approved, but we'll trial them out. Bigger levels of risk. Making sure that you spend the time with the executives to support them through those greater levels of risk. The inability to act is far more riskier than doing something wrong. That at least if they do something wrong, if they fail fast, they find out and they can move on. So it's sort of accepting some of that stuff. This is where I get really excited. A lot of the work over the last 2 years has been cross-organisational visibility. We heard earlier, I can't remember who it's from, but it was about the vaccines and the academics and the NHS and various other bodies. There was 10, 15 very, very large bodies, nationally, internationally, that had to come together to solve some of these problems. It's about having visibility of all of that across the beach and being able to see where are different groups at, what's happening over there with the researchers, what's happening over there with the supply chain, what's happening over there with deployment of vaccines, so on and so forth. It's having the whole of that visibility cross-organisational. A lot of people are very, very concerned about that, particularly in government, but the barriers are breaking down. But engender that cross-organisational visibility. And then the next one goes, I think, quite a long way, and I haven't heard very many people talk about this, but it's societal agility. We as a society need to become, and are becoming, and have become far more agile. We are demonstrating the ability, like a pod of dolphins, to be able to move as individuals, but as a group, and basically be very, very successful. And this term nimbleness, is it agility? Is it agile? Is it nimbleness? Is it something else? I think, was it Mike this morning put up, or Kevlin, the definition of agility? I quite like the definition of nimbleness. And that maybe we're beyond agility now and into nimbleness. Let's become more nimble. So they're the sort of 5 things that I think you need to come. So what about the future? Why do execs need to be supported? What's the future of organisational agility? What's the future of organisational agility? And I think there's 3 key themes that I'd like to propose. There are more and more and more extenuating external factors that we're going to find. You know, we've had them, we've had Brexit, we've had COVID, we've had Afghanistan, we've got climate change, you know, the list goes on. I don't want to bring everybody down, but they are going to become more often and more common, and we're going to have to deal with them. There's a growing introduction of new approaches, new techniques, new technology, and we're going to need agility and nimbleness to deal with those. And then finally, there's a need for cross-organisational collaboration. And I think it is not about organisational agility, it's about societal agility and cross-organisational agility. I need to get used to saying those phrases. So that there really wraps up our presentation.